Good evening, all. Tonight we are talking about Freud and James, a couple of psychologists that contribute to philosophy. I love the quote here by Freud, good stuff. Shows that he had a wit and could poke a little fun at himself. We're going to skip our scope here and head right into this. Now, not all of the great ideas in philosophy are actually contributed by philosophers. A fair number of them are contributed by folks that have no direct or overt connection to philosophy, but nonetheless are really pretty important. Freud probably doesn't need any introduction to us. I would doubt that any of you have not heard of Freud, but he's going to contribute to our problems of knowledge and of conduct and really makes his way into almost every academic discipline: aesthetics, literary criticism, moral philosophy, and so on and so forth. We've got this very Freudian viewpoint. So he attends the University of Vienna when he's 17, studies medicine there, and comes under the influence of some of the significant scientists there. Ernst Bruck, who will be pictured on the next slide, is associated with Müller at the top, as well as Ludwig, Dubois-Reymond, and Helmholtz, who we'll be seeing a couple slides from now. So Bruck and his compatriots said that they're not going to accept any biological principle. Think back to biology. All I remember is the mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell. Any biological principle that's not grounded in chemistry and physics. Helmholtz is going to say something that we're probably familiar with. We can't get any more from a physical system than the energy it begins with. And so biological systems are ultimately limited at being physical systems. Now, some of what is going to come out of this are what today we would call psychosomatic symptoms. Psycho refers to the mind, soma is the body. So psychosomatic are bodily symptoms that originate in the mind. Now, Freud is also going to incorporate a fair amount of Darwin in his thought. Darwinian theory, remember, gives us this design without a designer and this world of biological conflict and collision as we're trying to find out which is the fittest and therefore will survive. But ultimately, it comes down to how we get pleasure and avoid pain. And so it's impossible to come up with this biological psychology like Freudian analysis without a little bit of evolution at work within them also. Now, Freud's ambitions were pretty modest. All he wanted to do was be a research scientist in medicine and get an academic post at Vienna. But he's a Jew in a largely Roman Catholic city, and that's just not going to happen. So he begins to practice neurology, which is what he had been trained in. And his primary early contribution is this notion of hysterical symptoms. Women would go blind, have insensitivity, paralysis that really didn't seem to track back to any physical problem. Hysteria, kind of like the word hysterectomy, takes its name from the Greek word for uterus. It was thought that because of the complexities and differences of women's reproductive physiology, that only they could experience these symptoms. Freud also dabbled a little bit in hypnosis, like Jean-Martin Charcot, pictured here, but abandoned that because he said it's just too mysterious. Now, his friend, Josef Breuer, was working with a patient, the kind of infamous Anna O, who had a persistent cough, some paralysis, some sensory disturbances and hallucinations, and he was approaching this with a talking cure, which was exactly what it sounds like. He would talk to his patients and see what their problems were. And they discovered that this was kind of a cathartic, purgative type thing, and her symptoms lessened. So, movie recommendation: The Dangerous Method over there on the right, in which you've got Viggo Mortensen, Keira Knightley, and Michael Fassbender, or for the nerds among you, Aragorn, Guinevere, and Magneto. And as a psychic disturbance, the hysteria has to be a physical manifestation of some kind of psychic energy. Now, we don't mean psychic like fortune telling and all that kind of stuff. We just mean that it's a mental idea. And what they say the mechanism in this is, kind of going back to Helmholtz, the biological systems, is one of repression, literally to press again. Repression is sort of a hydraulic principle. Think of a hydraulic pump in which you've got some sort of fluid sealed within a closed environment, and as pressure's added to that, it has to go somewhere. If you can't express something at some level, it's going to be expressed elsewhere. So, armed with this, Freud's going to look at our survival mechanisms. Now, the way that we are just biologically made up, we seem to want to enhance our pleasures and minimize our pains. So, this is where we get the idea of the pleasure principle. We're designed in such a way to enhance pleasurable experiences and minimize those that might be painful. What Freud calls the reality principle is in a dialectical tension with this pleasure principle. So if we think back to Hegel and Fichte, we might see this. Most of the time, we have to behave in ways that deny us certain pleasures so we can live in society. So we can't overeat, we can't go after every member of the opposite sex that we want to. Let's see, we can't sleep too much, we can't work out too much. So we deny ourselves certain pleasures, for instance. Our primal, our most basic unconscious instincts, that's what he would call the id, have to be controlled. So maybe that's animal over there from the Muppets, have to be controlled by cultivating a moral conscience, which he is going to call the superego. This is derived from parental and ultimately social strictures and constraints. Now, remember, Jean Jacques Rousseau told us man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. Same kind of idea here. The ego and the superego are sort of up against us, keeping us from doing what the id would really like to do. Now, the self that we know to ourselves, I, the Latin word ego means I or me, is constructed out of this process of socialization, and the ego is a synthesis of the dialectical tension between the id, or thesis, and superego, antithesis. So the ego is sort of how we want to be viewed and the result of ultimately trying to make ourselves fit for rule in society. And so what happens is there's sublimation that takes place. Remember, limina means like a threshold in Latin. The liminal realm is that which we're aware of. When things are sublimated, they're pressed below that realm. And that's where we get repression, displacement, and so on. Now, the tensions generated in this ultimately can be relaxed, but never totally eliminated. We've got to live in society, and so necessarily we live an inauthentic life. Goethe would not be pleased with us. Beneath the surface rationality of all of this, we've got these complex intuitions taking place, and maybe they bring about weird dreams that were fit for civilization, but were discontented by it. Examples would be waking up with these hysterical symptoms, or because you have, horrid wishes that you can't face or reconcile within yourselves, you just feel guilty all the time. Now, what kind of wishes would you want to express? Why, Freud says sexual ones, of course. And this is where we get the infamous Oedipal complex. Basically, as boys move towards heterosexual sexual maturity, the target of their affections is their initial gratification, their mother. That leads them to desire their mother and disdain their father, and so on and so forth. Now, take from that what you will with an extremely healthy grain of salt. So Freud is going to be criticized by this, not really for the sexual content of this, but just that it's such a wild theory. Science was essentially observational or empirical during this, and it's kind of hard to make this testable. In fact, there really isn't a whole lot of testable methods available in Freud's time for the unconscious mind at all, much less how it's going to function. So, how can these repressed elements be uncovered? And he says, well, our dreams or our slips of the tongue, a Freudian slip is when you say one thing and mean another. These are psychopathologies of everyday life. So, this sort of shows us what our forbidden desires are that are hidden down at the base of all of these things. And he says, interpreting dreams is going to reveal to you what the unconscious is. Now, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about William James. We are, as before, going to skip our scope a little bit. James is kind of the quintessential Yankee philosopher, and he's going to come along when Hegel and Romanticism are really gaining traction in the American world. You've got these movements like the Transcendentalists, the back to nature worlds of Thoreau and Emerson and Channing, who are largely poets as well as other thinkers. He's not going to reject these, but he's going to bring to bear his own kind of thought on them. Now, Hegelian thought had overtaken English thought. And the idea was that this was going to spread and it was going to become invasive and really a big problem within higher education. And it kind of has. So James's project is to rescue thought from the world of mystery. Remember the romantic movement, that sort of half-seen truth just beyond the candlelight, while preserving its fluidity, purpose, and variegated nature. James is the eldest of four children, grandson of a multimillionaire, takes a long time to study at Harvard, reads voraciously, retains what he has, studies for a medical degree, and then just kind of goes off to the Amazon for a little while, attends lectures in Germany by Helmholtz and Wundt, and this is what starts to get him interested in psychology. So he completes his medical training, joins the faculty at Harvard, and he's giving lectures in physiological psychology, presiding over some experiments of his own. But he suffers from these maladies and depression, just really has a tough time of it. So the question of what comes up is, was Wundt or James the first academic experimental psychologist? James was a bit prickly on this, but I mean, his work, pictured there on the right, The Principles of Psychology, still a classic, still widely read, still something to take a look at if you are interested in psychology. After he completes this, almost all of his writing is mainly centered around the grounding of our knowledge. That is, what can we claim to know, as well as our ethical dimensions of life. And this is going to grow out of what he calls his radical empiricism. So, the usual idea or concession to empiricistic philosophies is kind of hedged. We use our senses to gather information about our world in most everything. Doors are hard, open them before you go through them. Ice is cold. Put on a coat if you don't want to be made cold by the presence of ice. This is not necessarily the position of a radical empiricist. This maintains that no single set of experiences, like mine or like yours or like anybody else's, has an authority to superior to some other set of experiences. And he gives, for example, religious experiences. If you attend a religious service of some type or have a religious experience of some sort, that's going to be completely unique to you and not necessarily like anybody else's at all, even if they're at the same sort of event. What figures in our imagination then is that it has to be dealt with uniquely and on its own terms. So he's going to critique associationist thought, like we saw with Hume, and the philosophy that goes along with it. Remember, associationist was based on this idea that corpuscular and elemental mental entities somehow are held together by repetition. I flip switches, lights come on, I come to associate the flipping of switches with lights coming on, and that as we assemble them this way, they become real ideas. He says, how did philosophy ever come to a view like that? Couldn't be on the basis of experience, because we don't really have experiences like that. If you remember the game Telephone that you played, the whole idea was to repeat a phrase to the person next to you and see if that phrase stayed the same or changed significantly by the time it made its way around the room. If we give each of 7 people one word of a sentence, none of them knowing which words are assigned to the other 6, nobody's going to really know what that sentence is, despite having an intimate connection to it, that is, having a piece of it. So James says the conscience is not a substance, it's not an entity, it doesn't occupy any physical space, but every idea is someone's, it is owned. So it's not an empty container waiting for us to fill it up with experiences, like Locke said, but a thought is not just a thought, it's my thought. The external world, then, I choose for its content, and I'm going to be experiencing that and associating it. Selection then comes to the core of our experience. So, where does that consciousness come from? Well, on the matter of the mental life, James is satisfied that we've got kind of this evolutionary course in the animal kingdom, and our place is somewhere around it. But how does that work? Darwin gives us sort of a continuity theory, so that somehow, we find creatures above or below in the phylogenetic series. Maybe they've got a bit less consciousness, maybe some with even less. We go down to my German Shepherd, who's dumb as a sack of hammers. We go down even further to, say, a slug crawling in my garden. How do we think of their consciousness? Are they aware in the same way that we are? So James knew that we don't explain consciousness by pointing to earlier manifestations or smaller versions of it, because they're not any easier to explain than our own. There are two ways we can think about things like survival of the fittest. We can think of it from the outside as this natural process, working on attributes, building bigger muscles, building quicker eyes, better hearing, and all that kind of thing. Or we could think of it in the terms of our actual direct experience. It appears as the intention to survive. So, focusing down there on that red text, no longer is it if survival is to occur, but it becomes kind of an imperative of you have to do this. Survival shall occur. Real ends are now showing up for the first time. And James is exposing a dangerous and overlooked connection in scientific work between phenomena dun, dun, da, 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 to be studied and the method of empirically investigating it. So James calls it the psychologist fallacy, the fallacy of assuming the mental process that we're studying operates in the same manner as the experiment that's being conducted. So let me give you an example. You're studying and you're using flashcards to help you remember a concept. Well, maybe that works for you, but maybe you don't learn according to flashcards. Maybe you learn better by having someone take apart the engine in front of you and put it back together and show you each individual step that's being carried out. Methods that study our memory by giving us repeated exposure to materials, then testing how much we retained after, kind of assume that repetition is what forms our memories. And James says, but it's not. What's called for then are better experimental modes that accommodate our mental processes as they actually take place. So we don't get rid of the laboratory, we just make the laboratory make more sense. James is going to take up this common sense tradition of Thomas Reid, remember one of our Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, that had kind of been lost while John Stuart Mill was coming into prominence. Common sense is how we meet daily challenges. And to be skeptical about it is kind of pointless because we do have evidence for it. But the common sense of one species is not that of another. Kind of going back to my German Shepherd, if I'm sitting and reading a book and my eyes are passing over the text, my dog is watching this and to her it's unintelligible. Is my set of experiences authentic and hers not? That's really problematic. So James is rejecting all of these attempts to try and filter experience so that only the contents compatible with favored theories are preserved. In other words, he says we have to take everybody's ideas into account, even if we don't particularly like them. Adopting this common sense realist position, then, he's able to kind of fend off Hegel and his criticism of science and one sidedness and say, we've got to think about this in different ways. Consciousness is not easily found in the body. It's not in the heart, it's not in the head, it's somewhere. But neither science nor philosophy advance by saying consciousness isn't there or doesn't exist. This is where we are going to leave off with James. We'll be picking back up with James' pragmatism and Ludwig Wittgenstein next time. Hope you've enjoyed it. Bye-bye.